Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Next Gen Information Management, Succeeding in a New Era. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are AIIM's Chief Evangelist, John Mancini, and Stephen Ludlow from OpenText. OpenText is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started, just want to offer a few pointers for you for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience. So feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows that you have on your desktop. Across the bottom of the screen is the list of all of the widgets that we've made available to you today. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list. That's to the right side of the slide area. And there are also a few other documents and links for you there to download or click on just to educate you more about today's topic. Feel free to click on those at any time. They'll open up in a new tab, and then you can save them off or look at them after the webinar. Feel free to ask questions throughout the hour using the Q&A feature. We will hold these questions until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them, but you can also use this feature to comment or ask for technical assistance. At the end of this webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and I'd greatly appreciate it if you take a few moments to complete it, offer your feedback, and to suggest other topics for us to cover. You can also access the survey in the list of widgets across the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. Now to introduce our speakers today, John Mancini, who's AIIM's Chief Evangelist, is an author, speaker, and respected leader within the AIIM global community of information professionals. He is a catalyst in social, mobile, cloud, and big data technology adoption, and an advocate for the new generation of experts who are driving the future of information management. John predicts that the next 3 years will generate more change in the way we deploy enterprise technologies and whom we trust with this task than in the previous 2 decades. And we also have with us Stephen Ludlow, and Stephen is a 20-year veteran of leadership and results management roles in information management, solutions, and consulting. Currently, he leads product marketing for OpenText Enterprise Business Unit, and in this role, he serves as a subject matter expert for ECM, information governance, and e-discovery, both internally and with OpenText's diverse client base. Stephen frequently speaks at industry and customer events on information governance and discovery trends, technologies, and best practices. So right now, I'm going to turn things over to John Mancini to begin his chat today. John?
Thank you, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. And in getting started, I thought I'd just give everybody a little bit of background as to what this thing is all about and why we're having this conversation today. And it goes to some changes that have been going on both in the overall environment as well as some particular in content management. And so I started thinking about how could I take some of that and try to make some sense of it, if for no other reason, for my own edification. And so created a white paper around it and talked to Stephen and said, would you guys be interested in sponsoring it? And he said, oh yeah, it really ties in with some of the things that we've been talking about in the marketplace. And so at the end of this webinar, you'll find a link to a white paper, and it's being launched today. So take a look at it. And so let me give you a little bit of background. So in June, I was in London, and I was there for an AIM meeting, and it was on the day that the Brexit vote was being held. And I talked to a lot of people and asked them what they thought would happen, and almost to a person, they all said that Brexit would not occur, that the UK would vote against it. And, of course, everybody knows what happened after that was that the vote was to exit the EU. And, that kind of began in the political realm, what I'm calling sort of the ouster of the incumbents year. And whatever your political beliefs are, certainly the victory of Donald Trump in November was a big surprise. In the sports realm, and I apologize for this analogy for people outside the United States or for people who were not baseball fans, But in the World Series this year, we had this crazy year where we had both the Cubs and the Indians. Cubs hadn't won since the early 1900s. The Indians hadn't won since 1948. So clearly something was weird going on in the sports realm that generated that. In the technology realm, I still haven't quite made heads or tails of Pokemon Go. I played around with it. I found a few little things along the way, but it mainly translated into people wandering around aimlessly, looking at their phones and bumping into things. And then the year culminated, and we got a couple of these devices. We actually got a Google Home as well as an Echo Dot, and all of a sudden, our devices were listening and listening and listening. And so in all sorts of ways, this was a year of some really big change. And this change was not confined just to the political and social and sports realm, but in the content management arena as well. And so, I think about where we started off the year, and we had all sorts of announcements about both acquisitions and diversifications and splitting of companies. You had Xerox announcing that it was going to split into two publicly traded companies. You had HP splitting into two companies. You had Dell completing the acquisition of EMC, including Documentum. We talked about that on a webinar a couple of weeks ago. You had Lexmark basically announcing completion of an acquisition by a consortium of investors and splitting off the enterprise software group and rebranding it as Kofax. And then as if all that wasn't enough, then my good friends at Gartner basically said that they were retiring the ECM term, and they were doing so because of a combination of three factors. One was that cloud, social, mobile, and analytics had changed ECM forever, that SharePoint, Office 365, G Suite, SaaS solutions had made content management available to everybody, and that all sorts of folks in the file sync and share business had changed what the expectations were about managing content. So, so the net of that was that this article on the death of ECM and the birth of content services. Now, I will say, just to tug on the tail a little bit of my friends at Gartner, a lot of us have been saying this for a long time. That this is not so much about the technology anymore. This is all about the applications. This is all about how you use content and documents in the context of business processes. And that while at one point this was focused almost exclusively on the technology side, this had shifted pretty significantly into an applications business over the course of the last couple of years. And so whilst some of us have been talking about this for a while, I think the whole notion of a leading analyst firm basically putting a stamp of retired on ECM has a lot of people talking about the space and talking about where the space is going, what it means, and where it's going to eventually wind up. And so that was the genesis. I thought, well, let me see if I could write down some thoughts in this white paper and see what folks think. So that's what we're going to go through here a little bit today. I'm going to ask Stephen along the way to just interject anytime he wants. I tend to talk really fast like a good Italian, and so I will try to provide some spaces along the way so that he can get a word in edgewise. So Stephen, anytime you want to chime in, just feel free to chime in. And then I think at the end, Stephen's going to talk a little bit about how his company, OpenText, sees this whole question of content services and the evolution of this space. So that's what we'll do in the next 40, 45 minutes. As Teresa said, we've got question opportunities here. Please don't hesitate to pose some questions either for me or for Stephen, or if you want to post comments as well, that's fine as well. So let's plow on here. And what does this mean? And is this whole notion of content services an evolution or a revolution? And I will tell you, I think from my perspective, it's really an evolution. It's an evolution of this space. And as I say, it represents essentially a punctuation point on this trend that we've been talking about for quite some time, that this is all ultimately about applications and about what people do with content and information, not so much about what it is as a technology. And so I thought that it might be useful to start the conversation with just a little bit of reflection about where has this space been. And some of you all have heard me talk about this in the past, but I thought it might be useful just to go through this a little bit and remind ourselves of where this space has been. My friend Marco sent some questions about this whole question of labels, and I think he raises some really good points. Sometimes I think, as we talk about document management, as we talk about content management, as we talk about content services now, we kind of obfuscate the point that what this is ultimately about is what people do with these things, not so much what they are. And sometimes I think that we just have to take a rest at times from some of the terminology and focus on how people are using content in order to really take a step forward. So with a little bit of reflection, here's a chart I put together thinking about what I always view as the core building blocks of our space, which are people, processes, and technology. And then reflecting a little bit, based on the 20 years that I've been doing this, about the three eras that we've been through during my time here. And, I think about what document management was all about when I first got to AIIM, and it was all about mission-critical processes that were document-intensive, that were very, very custom, very, very complex, very, very expensive, used almost exclusively by Fortune 500 scale organizations. They tended to be pretty difficult to use, but we didn't really care about that because just a very, very small group of specialists actually used this technology. We evolved into the ECM era, and ECM was never really a very perfect term. It actually, I think was ideally should have described how people think about issues associated with managing information as opposed to a set of technologies, but it became shorthand for a set of technologies. And we saw the space start to shift in the direction of more knowledge workers using it. We tried to make the case that this was an enterprise layer, but the reality, when we look back at this, these solutions were still largely driven by departments, and as a result, silos exploded in many organizations. And then we saw, on the vendor side of the equation, we saw all sorts of acquisitions to try to create suites of capability. And then SharePoint came along in the marketplace in the late 2000s and basically blew that up and blew up all the price points that were traditionally associated with this space. And then as you get into the last couple of years, we've moved into what I would call more of the mobile and cloud content management era. And, this is an era in which usability becomes everything. All the lines blur between structured and unstructured information, between home and office. We start having people really, really get serious about business processes beyond some of those industrial strength ones that were the hallmark of the early stages of document management. And we started to see another big disruption come from the file sync and share players and from a focus on basically every knowledge worker touching these tools. And so as you think about this, I cover this basically as some background to talk a little bit about, okay, well, if we understand a little bit of where we've been, what does this all mean in terms of where we're going, and what does that future look like, and what are we hearing basically from end users as we talk to folks? What kinds of questions do they raise with us? How are they viewing this space when I look at some of the answers that people give on some of our surveys? And what does this ultimately say about the functional requirements on the sell side that match up against that? So I thought what I would do is basically go through some of the things that I'm hearing. As I say, I think this is an evolution, not a revolution. I think that content is changing. It still remains something that's really, really critical to business process solutions. And whether you want to call it content services or whether you want to call it, magic dust, I frankly don't really care because it's all about what you do with it rather than so much about what it is. So let me start with this question of what's on people's wish lists and how does this translate into functional requirements? And this will be a place, Stephen, that I hope you'll chime in here, and then I'll try to give you a little bit of space to comment in. So is that cool with you, Stephen? I'll just kind of go through some of these things that I've been thinking, and maybe you could just kibitz as I go.
Perfect.
Good. All right. So first of all, when we talk to folks, what we hear is that they clearly want cloud options. Now, a lot of people aren't ready for cloud yet, and they will basically say, this is not something that we're really interested in right now, but it is something that we want in our capabilities. And so I think the way that translates on the vendor side is that, vendors that want to position themselves long-term have to ultimately have options that can be very quickly deployed, that are very elastic, that can be available on any kind of device, that can be updated without a whole lot of falderall along the way. And so what you start to see is the vendor community respond to that user need about a clear cloud strategy.
So we're seeing very much the same thing. I think two parts to that is that there are far fewer companies today that are digging their heels in and saying, absolutely, we would not go to the cloud. I think a lot of organizations are now, at many different industries and levels of organizations and size of organizations, saying, yes, we would go cloud. But what we're absolutely seeing on the vendor side now is the desire for almost every organization, if not to actually buy cloud, to have a cloud buying experience, so that they can they can look at the experience, look at the application, use it, try it out very quickly, deploy it quickly, start small and grow. All the things that organizations want to get from the cloud and even their consumer applications and the other applications that they've used, like Office 365, is tempering their view on how they want to buy software today, regardless of whether it's actually on-premises or in the cloud or a hybrid. So absolutely spot on.
I think that translates into the second one we hear from people, which is, we've been talking about capture for a long time, and what I hear from end users is, okay, we get it, we're doing it, we're storing stuff, but what we really need help with is that this isn't a question of just getting paper into systems anymore. This is a question of taking all sorts of inputs, rationalizing the stream of inputs, digitizing the stream of inputs, and being able to integrate them into a business process. And the label that I just put on this is that, when vendors talk about capture, they've got to talk about intelligent capture as something that's much more than traditional capture moving forward. Third thing is this consumer test, and you were alluding to this earlier, Stephen, is that, at one point, kind of a mobile adaptable solution was like a nice to have in content management. I think a lot of content management companies, frankly, were kind of slow to come to this whole question of mobility and meeting the usability tests that it was important to people. But it's table stakes now. If you don't have that, if you don't have a solution that is dirt easy for people to use, it's kind of dead on arrival, I think, in a lot of organizations. And that translates into what vendors have to look at very, very seriously in terms of their own solutions and how they deploy those solutions. Not only how easy are they to use, but how easy are they to deploy for the organization.
Yeah, I think there's been a democratization of the enterprise, and for all that we talk every day about the digitization or digitalization of the enterprise, we usually think about it as how do we focus on our external customers. I think a lot of organizations are thinking about their enterprise software in the same sort of way, however, and beginning to realize that they need to engage their internal customers, the people that are actually using the applications, in a very similar way, and make sure that the experience that they're having is just as fluid, just as built into their business processes, et cetera, as they would with their external customers as well. And when you begin to flip it that way, you begin to realize that a consumer-grade experience means being built into business process, and allowing you to get things done from an enterprise software perspective. And I think that's the important part around this too.
Yeah, I think I've called this in a couple of places. It's almost like an inside-out view of content management. That it used to be that the consumer-grade experience was a nice bolt-on to an existing set of technologies and process applications, and that was fine. But it's like the next era now. Now it has to, I think, almost start with the whole question of how does a knowledge worker interact and utilize information in the context of their jobs, and then redefine processes around that rather than the other way around.
That's right. The integration level is not the person in the seat.
Yeah, which is far too prevalent. That probably ties to this next question, which I think most people realize that we moved away from this a number of years ago, but I think it's still worth stating because I think there still is an idea that there's some sort of repository nirvana out there, and I think my take when I talk to folks, nobody's going to rip out any repositories. Nobody is going to rip out a mission-critical process. They've got to get over this question of thinking that this all has to reside in one place and develop strategies and approaches that, for lack of a better term, I'm calling repository agnostic. Does that kind of make sense in kind of how you see customers evolving?
I still think that there's a lot to be said for some of the things that we were aspiring to from an ECM perspective around being able to have, at least in, through business processes, a single source of the truth and being able to find information across those business processes, et cetera. But the truth is absolutely every organization will have many, many different repositories. Maybe from a vendor side of the world as well, I think that we also have come to understand in a lot of cases those repositories are not necessarily going to be as up to date and in the latest version and the latest releases we always hope they would as well. So having to deal with knowing that there'll be a very long tail of ECM systems out there over the next few years as we begin to change and become more cloud-like is another thing that I think as a vendor we have to understand, and customers have to understand that customers maybe would like to be there, but ECM is still built into their business processes in a lot of cases.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, and I think having a source of truth and a understanding of what is the source on that particular thing. I think we used to equate that with a single repository, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that. Makes things more complicated, but it doesn't have to be that. This next one I'm going to kind of gloss over a little bit because I think we've talked about this, but it's this question of mobility and collaboration and the central role that plays. Let me hop to the next one because I've been spending a lot of time reading and thinking about the GDPR, for example, in Europe. And I think this is one I think that, frankly, AIIM should be talking a bit more of because this question of compliance gets so complicated in an organization that has any scale of any sort, and I don't see it getting better quickly. And I think people are really struggling with their manual processes here, and I think that solution providers really need to push the envelope in terms of taking a much, much more automated approach to this and getting the human element out of this.
I would agree, and I think my first step when it comes to automating governance is this idea that if you're going to automate anything, you're going to first have to capture that information that you're going to automate, right? So allowing information to run freely doesn't equate to governance at any time. That said, my true belief when it comes to governance is that it can be very complicated, but we have to start with some of the pragmatism of understanding the content that we have and taking sort of broad swaths at it before getting into the complications sometimes around semantic and auto-classification, which obviously we do, but I think it's important first to think about how you're actually getting the information, capturing the information, and how important that information is before you get bogged down in the deep, dark arts of records management and compliance, et cetera. So pragmatism starts our conversation.
The dark arts of records management. There you go. I think this next one really ties directly into this notion of content services, and maybe that's really at the core of what some of this is all about, which is that, as process applications have changed, it used to be that, when we thought about business processes, we tended to start with content and then go to process, and I think it's moving the other way around now, where we start with process and then go to content, which says that the way that you access content needs to be fairly open and portable, and so I think that's a big part of what's driving some of these changes in terminology, if nothing else. And I think that ties to the last point here, which is that, and I think this is a bigger story that probably is worthy of a whole nother conversation, and that's I think that ultimately conversations that are limited to just content services are marginalizing and not really enough for what users are trying to do. And I constantly run into end users who say, we are really trying to focus on these much bigger customer journeys and customer experiences, and those customer journeys and customer experiences certainly involve content, and they certainly involve customer information, and they involve a lot of data as well. And so that notion, and you guys have talked about this for a while, Stephen, this notion of enterprise information management as opposed to just content management, I think we have to keep that story in our heads too as we talk about content services. I think we need to think that it is not just content that end users have to focus on.
So, John, could I be the worst kind of guest and maybe bring you back right to the very beginning and ask you to maybe put a little bit bigger definition, or your definition, around what content services actually is? I don't think we've really addressed that from the beginning of the webinar right now, and it might be worthwhile stopping to think again about just exactly what we're talking about around what content services are and why it's not necessarily ECM.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the primary difference, I think, for me, and I think this is part of the confusion that people have, frankly, is that people haven't put a whole lot of definition around this. Is that the term ECM, I think, implies a certain set of self-contained, if you will, processes in which content and massive amounts of content is the primary driver of those processes, and that it's almost like we've always assumed over the years that ECM is the lead application, if you will. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a sec. And I think where we're moving into is a role in which content still plays an important role. Content is certainly an important fuel of business processes, but that this thing that we call ECM is no longer in the lead. It means a different kind of a role for people that have focused on ECM. I think it focuses to the applications that leverage content for specific business purposes, and it may sound like a nuance, but I think it's an actual change. It means that it's process first, then content, rather than content first, then process, I think is kind of what this is all about. Your take? 100%
agree with what you've said already, and I think that in part the nomenclature around content services are individual componentized capabilities that can be inserted into business process, into business applications, and into potentially even web applications or applications that are sometimes internal to the organization, sometimes external to the application. So essentially a lot of the functionality that we would expect within ECM, but being used discreetly at the right time at the right place instead of exposing end users to all the capabilities of ECM and having them try and figure out what the heck I should be using at any given time. So version control may be very important at some time, but for 90% of users in a lot of cases, version control most of the time is just happily going on in the background. And exactly that idea is you don't need to expose version control to end users unless it makes sense within the confines of the business application that you've created for them. So again, it's that capacity to use the discrete capabilities of ECM without necessarily exposing it all, and without ECM having to be, as you point out, the lead application.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's actually something that I've noticed. I'm trying to figure out how to explain it. I think there are many places in which good enough content management is good enough, and there are other places in which very rigorous content management is necessary. And I think the history of this industry has sometimes been to assume that everybody needs all the bells and whistles that the most robust content management application requires have to be extended into everything. And I think if there's an evolution relative to content services, I think what it's all about is acknowledging the fact that, like you say, that you need different capabilities at different times for different tasks, and being able to deliver those in a more portable way, I think, is a huge step forward. Let me switch gears a little bit. I didn't know if you wanted to.
No, I figured you. I heard the clutch go in, and you were shifting gears.
Okay, you heard the gears flowing. So anyway, let me. So I spent some time thinking about, okay, well, what should organizations be thinking about here? And this might be a place where we get a little bit controversial in some of these things. Some of these may be more my personal opinion than organizational, but I thought that part of the point of this paper is to tee up a conversation, because I don't think we've collectively as a community had a conversation of how is this space changing and what does it mean. So, and again, Stephen, feel free to kibitz anywhere along the way you want. Point one, and it goes probably, obviously, I think I've said this 2 or 3 times already, we do need to resist this impulse to simply throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is that there's sometimes a tendency to say, oh, well, this was ECM, now it's not ECM anymore, and now it's this thing called content services. And that's just not reality in organizations. Organizations, I think, have a lot of complicated questions to ask themselves about where do you rip and replace, where do you leave things alone, how do you leverage what you currently have relative to ECM, how do you continue to maintain existing mission-critical legacy systems and invest in new customer-centric initiatives. These aren't easy questions, but I think they're more easily addressed by understanding that you don't start by ripping out. You start by analyzing what you have, what it can do, what its capabilities are, where there are redundancies, and then go from there. And so that, again, I think represents sort of an evolutionary approach. So that's kind of point one, I think, that I'd throw out there.
I would also say that what organizations can and should be thinking about as well is how to extend what they have as well.
Yeah.
In that, particularly if they're in up-to-date applications, it doesn't really matter which ECM application is. Most of them are supporting standards. Most of them support and have APIs. And so those are, in fact, services that can be extended into other applications as necessary to provide that discrete functionality necessary to achieve or complete a certain task without necessarily having to go directly to ECM and have it be the lead application again. And so, I think most organizations not only, don't want to throw the baby out, and in a lot of cases they can't throw the baby because the baby's grown up and moved into your attic, like a teenager, I suppose, maybe.
Second point, and this ties to, I think, people in this community is what I'm trying to drive at here, is that I think that people in this community have to kind of reach out of their comfort zone, if you will, and help their organizations understand better how to connect the dots. And what I mean by that is that, you see all these articles, C-level executives are scared to death about disruptive competitors. They're demanding new business transformation and customer experience initiatives in their organization. And I think a lot of them don't really understand that there's a core set of competencies, a core set of technologies that often exist in their organizations within the governance and content management arena that are directly germane to solving some of those big C-level concerns that they have. And I think what we all need to do is get a bit more outside of our comfort zone in terms of those competencies and help the organization understand that there are competencies and technologies within their organizations that are useful to the challenges that they face. So that's the second point, I guess, about helping organizations connect the dots. Third one is that, and I talk to a lot of vendors, and I talk to a lot of end users, and I think that, one of the things that we have to understand is that there's a lot of variation in the marketplace in terms of solutions right now, and that's not a bad thing. And so, you have people that all they want to do is solve a contracts management problem, and there are solutions out there to do that. There are people out there that haven't even gotten rid of paper, and there are solutions out there for that. There are people that have been down those journeys before and are interested in fashioning strategies to develop more holistic customer experiences that, start at origin and go all the way to conclusion and involve probably like 5 or 6 or 7 sub-processes along the way and involve a lot of data along the way. And there are solutions for that. And so I think one of the core things that at AIIM we have to help people understand is that everybody's at a different starting place. Everybody's at a different place in terms of where they're trying to go. And there are a lot of different solutions out there, and matching those capabilities and those complexities to where you are and where you're trying to go is more complicated than it once was. And there are no universal solutions out there. So point 3. Point 4, and again, this doesn't come as news to people that have been doing this for a while, but, metadata is the key element in weaving together environments that involve multiple repositories. It's key to building some sort of sanity amongst your knowledge workers to actually be able to find stuff. It's key to figuring out some sort of sane approach to an automated approach to managing content assets. If the days of a single repository are over, then I think we need many more conversations about how we use semantic technologies and auto-classification technologies to add intelligence via metadata where it doesn't exist right now, and help make that easier for people. So that's kind of my fourth point in terms of
that one in particular for me, John, is an area that I could evangelize on for hours. If I have an actual full webinar, we can do it. But the fundamental thing about metadata, from my perspective, is it takes what we have in terms of unstructured information and our inability to do anything much more than, in a lot of cases, full text search on the content, and it changes those documents in most cases into information very similar to information that's in structured data, and all the things that we can do with structured data. Mm-hmm. We can query structured data. We can relate structured data. We can link structured data from through business processes. We can do the things like faceting information, so we can go from searching to finding. There are just so many things that are possible through the application of good metadata, but at the same time it has been the bane of most of the ECM implementers' lives for a very long time, in both defining what metadata needs to be applied and how to get it applied appropriately without interfering with end users. And I think that's an important thing to, if nothing else, ask about when you're thinking about your ECM applications moving forward and the content that you're creating, is how are we going to apply metadata in a consistent manner that makes the information more valuable.
Yep. My fifth and sixth ones, I'm going to do these together because I think they're tied together. Which, the first one, and I'm not trying to, say that it's not important to go back and do backfile conversion where it's relevant and get sort of the past under control. But I do think moving forward, I think this challenge, I see so many organizations get so hung up with trying to take what they already have and deal with it. And that's a pretty tough recipe in an environment in which information is increasing at geometric rates. And my fear for a lot of organizations is that they're in a leaky boat syndrome and they'll never catch up. And, the holes in the boat represented by more and more information coming into the organization, if you get too preoccupied with trying to create a perfect environment for what you already have, you'll just get overwhelmed by all the new stuff coming in. And that kind of ties a little bit to the next one, my weird Dr. Strangelove point. I'm probably showing my age there about stop worrying and learn to love the bomb, is that I think many organizations have a perfection approach when it comes to thinking about records management and governance. And it ties back to the point that you made earlier, Stephen, about lots and lots of different capabilities are relevant at lots and lots of different points depending on the individual context and the information associated with that context. And I think that organizations that look forward have to start thinking about this question of information management less from the perspective of records management perfection and more from the perspective of risk mitigation realities, and use that risk mitigation point to position your governance initiatives. I think we're moving into an environment in which I had a fellow from JPL at one of our meetings talk about chaotic architectures and architectures that will be on the fly and architectures that will be changing constantly. And I think if that's the norm, the new weird norm that we're moving into, then I think we have to get comfortable with a certain level of ambiguity. We have to get more comfortable with the bomb and just figure out how we reduce risk. And I know that might be somewhat of a controversial point for some people out there. You have a take on that one. First, who Dr. Strangelove.
I do. But it's actually a transformation that I've had to make myself coming from an e-discovery and information governance background, is that if you're having a hard time convincing, in particular, senior executives in your organization, et cetera, that they need to care, it's not that they shouldn't necessarily care. You have to understand that they probably have other priorities. And coming to grips with those other priorities and knowing to do, again, being pragmatic and getting the best that you can get done is still a good way forward in a lot of cases. And it's not ignoring the bomb, but it's knowing that you're going to have to live beside it.
So let me skip over a couple of here and do them quickly because I do want you to give a chance to talk about, from a company perspective, how you see this evolution occurring. And there's a lot of good questions, and I want to make sure that we get time to those. So let me just tell you what I was thinking about some of these just very quickly. First is this point about embracing and experimenting in new technologies. And what was driving me there is again, we had the chief technology officer from the Jet Propulsion Labs at one of our meetings, and he talked about a really innovative culture in which they take consumer technologies like Alexa, for example, voice recognition technologies, and apply them to how organizations interface with back-end databases. And he talked about an environment in which they have these competitions in their organization in which people come and pitch a 6-minute pitch where they pitch an innovative approach they want to take to a particular technology, and if they like those approaches, they fund them on the spot. So my main point is that there's a lot of change going on out there. We can't get so hamstrung, again, with perfection that we don't see the next waves of technology that are coming. Eighth point here is that, I think that I see people use the terms records management and information governance interchangeably. They're different. and I think we ought to keep that in mind moving forward. You know, your hardcore approach to managing the business records of an organization is different from the strategy of how you manage the overall information assets of the organization, and I think we have to make sure that we don't forget that. Organizations, I think, need to invest in data competencies. And then this last one, which maybe, Stephen, that would be a good jumping off point to some of the comments that you want to make, is I think we're in the environment, this is hard for people to admit that have been doing ECM for a long time, is that ECM isn't the lead dog anymore when it comes to a lot of business processes. It's critically important, but it's not the lead dog in terms of how those processes are defined. And the emphasis, I think, shifts from integrating content into business processes rather than defining those processes solely in terms of the content itself. And so with that, let me see if you have any comments on that last point, Stephen, and then hand off to you. And I will admit that I am having a bit of a computer problem, so if you could change the screen, Teresa, when you have a chance, and I will see if I can.
I'm all good, and I can continue on, John. Well, maybe you scan through some of the questions.
Continue on. Go ahead.
Under control. Yeah. So first thing I really wanted to do was try and put some, when we begin to talk about things like content services, people are not sure what they are. They can't really picture them. They don't necessarily understand where they fit in. So I thought I'd try and show them a little bit in action, and maybe start off with you know, a wry chuckle at ourselves even, by stating that a couple of weeks ago, John and I got on a webinar to discuss the future of Documentum inside OpenText. And we were very careful, I think, to make sure that we were charting a little bit of a future for OpenText and Documentum together, and wanted to chart out for our customers that they were safe. And we were saying that they were safe really in two key ways. We were saying that we fully support the part about not throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to both Documentum and Content Server, and realizing that there will be a long tail of need for what would be considered heavy-duty ECM activity, and knowing that for a lot of organizations, ECM is built directly into their business processes. But as per my comments, I think it was also very important to be able to extend those applications as well. And so part of our strategy was really being able to leverage those ECM applications with additional content services. And the content services that we're talking about are APIs and you know, content services, case services, things that can be, again, discrete capabilities that can be bubbled up into applications, or that can be bubbled up into extensions into other applications and lead applications that already exist. And what I really wanted to do is kind of, first of all, prove out, that we have to be a little bit careful when we start talking about content services as technology as opposed to what we get out of it. And then second of all, I really wanted to be able to provide some sort of real-world examples so you could wrap your head around it a little bit. So the first thing I did, of course, was include John's favorite slide in my deck, because anytime I put this slide, John thinks we've had a good webinar. And it's a bit of a baseball analogy. But it's been kind of a talking point for me for a couple of years, which is ECM, particularly the ECM applications that we've built in a lot of cases like libraries, where we've created shelves, we've created an entire massive building with infrastructure, put all the shelves in place and said, everybody come on and put your books in. And in a lot of cases, that just frankly hasn't happened. We've created ECM applications where people have not come along and put the content in or used the application to put and manage their content. And there are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which we were talking about adoption problems. We were talking about having to use metadata. We talk about very often very deep and complex folder structures. We talk about, in a lot of cases, not necessarily being integrated in with a business problem, but much more being associated to a filing activity that comes after a business process. And so from the get-go, what we thought of was very, very, very akin to content services, which is instead of having people come to ECM, why can't we bring ECM to where people are actually working? And so kind of a classic OpenText solution, in this case you're seeing it inside of Salesforce, is the ability to be able to embed ECM capabilities, basic lightweight folders inside of lead business applications where people need to access and potentially upload, collaborate, et cetera, the things that we do with our documents within a business process, and in particular within the business application of that business process. And so from a content services perspective, what we're really doing is using widgets to embed content directly into, in this case, Salesforce, but there are a lot of other applications we can do it for too. And from a pure anatomy of an integration perspective, what we're really doing is using services to help, first of all, once we've defined what a business object is, in this case it might be in Salesforce, it might be an account, or it might be a person in an HR system, but we define a business object, create a template, model a template of folder, lightweight, very small folders, and 2 or 3 folders necessary to contain the information typically for that particular business object or case. And then every time one is created in the lead application, we sync the metadata, the roles, potentially the records management classification, all the things that are necessary for that particular small business object, and then we percolate it back up into the lead application. That's a basic premise of content services in action, being able to actually not only embed the application in the ECM into the application, but at the same time linking to the lead application for metadata. And as I pointed out, metadata is one of my areas that I think is really, really important. And in being able to synchronize this metadata, we're really changing around the documents so that they're very easily findable. They can be found as in the same way that we're interacting, as an example, with Salesforce. We're interacting with Salesforce or SAP or other database applications using queries and being able to pull the information forward. In a lot of cases, actually being able to pull information forward based on relationships without actually having to search for it in the first place. And then I just wanted to very briefly bring out the Leap platform, and the same idea applies. And the reason I brought up the Leap platform is I actually pulled a slide from one of our technical diagrams. And if you find yourself in a position where you're talking about content services in the way that that they truly work, they can seem very, very scary, right? So we're getting down into the attributes of particular files, how we interact with it. That's important for people that are going to be building the applications, and in some cases, a lot of IT departments actually looking to be able to pull together composite applications. But the truth is, you still need to have a business problem. It's not a content services problem, it's a business problem. And that business problem might be loan applications, and the fact that you're interacting with somebody in the outside world, a customer who needs to provide a number of documents that very typically have come in through fax and through email and through paper forms, et cetera. And how do you actually go about doing that? Well, content services could allow you to extend or build out your own application with additional case services to be able to provide basic document exchange with the customer. And again, from a buyer perspective, I think we need to think about it as, yes, you can go out and create your own application should you choose to and embed this functionality into it, but you can also look to the vendors to be able to provide those applications or those miniature applications to embed into your business process as well. So I think, when it comes down to it, my point for all this is don't think about it as content services. Think about it as the things that you're trying to achieve and how you can use those content services to more easily achieve those things without necessarily having to go through the entirety, in a lot of cases, of bringing along the entire ECM system with it, but just some of the discrete services provided by the things we've typically thought of as ECM. And I think with a couple of resources there for you to download and look at later, I think back to you, John, for some questions if you've managed to get a hold of your computer.
Yes, I did. That was a first for me, and my entire screen went dark all of a sudden. So it was like, oh my goodness! But thank goodness people can't see behind the curtain. So a couple questions here. First of all, just to make sure people check out these resources here, and I think those are really worthwhile to get a sense. And what we'd like to do is really continue some of this conversation. Granted that it's an early stage in the conversation, so some of this will continue at the AIIM conference. So if you haven't registered for that, I think there's actually a blip here later on. I'll just hop ahead so that folks can see it. If you haven't registered for it, you really should, because this will be a big topic, talking about this moving forward over the course of over the next year or so. Also, as we release this white paper, and we're releasing it today, so make sure that you check out this link. We'll send everybody a link that was on this webinar so that you can download it directly. We do have a community site within AIIM. I'll be teeing up a conversation about this. So if you haven't been to that community site, I would really urge you to go to it and check it out, and let's continue this conversation. I think my good friend Bob Sagami in one of the questions talked about, is it too early to really talk about a definition of content services? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think this definition is going to evolve over time, and I think it's a good place to have a lot of conversation as a community in terms of what we think it means, what are the skills that are necessary in order to optimize a much more modular approach to content capabilities, like Stephen was talking about. And so download the white paper, make sure you connect up with some of the conversations, and let's continue these conversations moving forward. So a couple questions, maybe this might be one for you, Stephen, to start with, is talking about the connection between unstructured data in documents and structured data in systems like product systems and ERP systems and things like that. And connecting the two, and are there lessons from the latter that could be used in the former? And maybe you'd just like to talk about that intersection between structured and unstructured information.
That's actually one of my favorite topics, actually, which is
another one. We could do another webinar on this one too.
Exactly. So one of the things, having been an ECM practitioner and consultant all over the board, is death of many ECM projects is the definition of metadata and trying to come to a common metadata structure for the entirety of their ECM application. See that time and again, where by the time they define the metadata, it's out of date. The good news from my perspective is if we begin to look to business process and business applications to help us define and synchronize our metadata, the good news is in most cases that's actually already defined within the organization, or at least within the confines of a business process, which is how we typically try to find our information in the first place. Is that if you look to the lead applications that you might be adding your content services into, you'd actually find that, as an example, if you are adding it to an HR system, all the things around all the way from the user ID to the person's personnel number to the person's start date to the person's end date, all the information necessary to not only be able to query that information, but probably also to records manage that information, is already being defined and updated within the confines of the lead application. And that for me is always the starting point for defining metadata. And if you can synchronize that metadata, then you're going to find managing your unstructured information to be far simpler, both from a findability perspective, a usability, and even a records management perspective.
A question here that many companies, this might be for me, many companies still look for document management solutions. We spent years explaining what enterprise content included documents, which is why they are used for document management. Now we're supposed to explain to those same customers that content services also means that we can manage their documents. And it basically, harkens back to a long-term problem in this space, which is the definitional context. And I think part of the reason that the definitions get so convoluted and complex goes back to my point that I was making earlier, that there's lots and lots of different flavors of solutions and lots of different positions that users find themselves in these days. And so, again, going back to what I said before, I think the reason that the definitions are so difficult, in which case, it might imply that we need sort of almost like a minimalist set of definitions, because every time you try to get more comprehensive, you wind up getting so convoluted that you don't really describe anything. And because, there are user organizations out there, and I come into them all the time, that are just trying to get rid of paper. There are user organizations that couldn't care less about an enterprise strategy. Maybe they should, but they don't right now. And all they're interested in is a SaaS solution to solve a particular business problem. There are organizations that I run into all the time that are doing incredibly sophisticated things in combining data capabilities with content capabilities. And so the reality is that when we try to apply technology definitions to all of those disparate sorts of things, I think that's why things get so convoluted. And so that comes back, I think, to a central point that we were making earlier, and Stephen, I think you were making earlier, is that ultimately this is about applications. Ultimately this is about what you're trying to do, and that if we define the problems in terms of what you're trying to do, maybe some of the technology obfuscation will be mitigated along the way. Personal opinion, probably not an organizational one.
That sounded like a good closing to me.
Oh, okay. Oh, goodness, we're already up to an hour. Teresa, you're flipping these slides, which means that you probably need me to close. So why don't you do a quick close, and then maybe Stephen and I will each have kind of one concluding thought. I apologize. I lost control for a second.
It's okay. It sounds like a plan here. Just wanted to remind everyone to download the resources that's to the list to the right side of the slide area. A lot of good references there, and the link to the white paper that John mentioned, as well as those resources that Stephen mentioned, are all in that list. So feel free to click any of those resources, and you can open them up in just a few minutes. Also, when a webinar is over, a brief survey is going to open on your desktop. Again, I value your feedback and appreciate if you take a few moments to complete that survey. Thank you very much to our underwriter, OpenText. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM wouldn't be able to provide you with these free educational programs like our webinar series. So thank you, OpenText, for your sponsorship and your support. So as John said, as we're bringing our webinar to a close, and want to ask each of our speakers for a closing thought or a key takeaway. So I'm going to start first with Stephen Ludlow of OpenText. Your closing thoughts today.
My closing thoughts is that this is obviously still very, very new for vendors and our customers, and that the trick for the next little while, I think, from the practitioner and customer perspective, will be identifying opportunities where it makes more sense to be able to use some of those discrete content services built into business process, as opposed to trying to push ECM to their end users via policy and via training. And so as much as possible, if we can get to the point where ECM fades somewhat into the background, people don't even know that they're using it, they're simply interacting with their content in the way that they want to in the right application, in the right business process, we've probably come to a very good spot.
Thank you, Stephen.
That's pretty good.
John Mancini, your closing thoughts.
I think there's two things I'd like to leave with. One is that I think this content services term is in its early gestation, if you will, and I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think ultimately we need to keep in mind that there is a short-term story that people need to understand within their organizations, which is that ultimately this is all about applications and processes. And how do you develop content strategies that are much more modular in nature, that tap into particular content capabilities that you need in the context of a particular application that you're trying to solve in a particular business problem that you're trying to solve. And so, if you want to call that content services, great. Certainly can't be any more confusing than ECM along the way. But I think that the notion there is much more modular capabilities delivered in the context of applications. That's kind of point one. Point two is maybe a bigger parting thought, is I think all of this is part of a bigger story, which is that, we've created a world in which we've put some artificial dividing lines between content and data over the years. I think that we're moving into a world in which, this really is all about, finally, about information management, and information being data plus content. And so I would really urge people to take a look at the CIP program. I think we're going to find that we were ahead of that curve, and in the next 2 or 3 years, that skill set associated with managing both data and content is going to be critically important moving forward. With that, we will leave you till the next time, and make sure that you check out the recording when it's available. Thank you again to OpenText and to Stephen for being here today. And make sure you download the white paper. Let's have this conversation. Let's talk about where this space is going, and we really appreciate all the different people that have contributions to that conversation. So until the next time, this is John Mancini and Stephen Ludlow and Teresa Resick signing off.